Hello, it's my Wolfpack, Charlie Black 20, back again with another video about Nuremberg and the famous trial that went along with it. So, last video we covered who was going to be the prosecution and the judges and how things were going to shape up for those guys because it was going to be a hard road. Now we're going to cover a much more complex and in many ways fascinating group of individuals. We're going to cover the defendants and what they are charged with. So we're going to start with what the International Military Tribunal was charging these 24, really 22 men with. So first crime against peace. Crimes against peace was the aggressive war charges, meaning that every time the Nazis invaded a country, they were breaking the law because pretty much none of these countries declared war on Germany other than Great Britain and France, but they gave them advance notice like, hey, don't invade Poland. We won't declare war on you. Germany did. They had fair warning. Next was war crimes, which would be like Allied soldiers being shot without trial. So like against the Russian soldiers, very easy to prove. Allied, French, American, British, there were plenty of massacres done against them, against other countries that fought alongside the Allies, and pretty much the idea of how you treat your prisoners of war, as well as crimes against civilians, such as retaliatory executions and things like that, reprisal shootings. Then you had conspiracy, which was actually a foreign concept to the continental system because the idea of to plan to break the law breaking the law in and of itself was a foreign concept to them. Whereas in Britain and America, the idea of planning to break the law is breaking the law. And the idea was there was this common conspiracy among the Nazi leadership to commit these horrific crimes of aggression, war crimes, and the final charge of crimes against humanity, which would later be known as genocide in the following Nuremberg trials. So, in essence, the International Military Tribunal was treating this as though it was a mafia case, you could say, in the United States, where one individual, one part of the Nazi gang or government didn't necessarily need to be exactly in the know of what one part was doing if they were committing crimes in another area or supporting it in another way. So it was basically almost like an organized crime case in that sense. That was how a lot of the American and British legal theorists were able to sell this idea to the continental French and Russians. So, and crimes against humanity really covers everything the Nazis did to what at the time the Allies believed was nearly everyone they came in contact with, but in reality, as more evidence grew, it became a specific crime against the Jews, otherwise known as the Holocaust. They would try, again, these 24, but really 22 individuals of the Nazi hierarchy. They would also be trying 6 Nazi organizations that included the SS, the Gestapo, the Reich Cabinet, the Leadership Corps of the Nazi Party, the General Staff, and the SA. These 6 organizations were, again, being treated similar to a mafia. If you were a part of this organization, it would be declared an illegal one, and you could be tried after this trial for simply being a member of it and charged by whatever crimes you might have committed as a member of that organization. So you could be tried after this as a smaller, lower level person. That was how the Americans thought it was going to go, that they were going to keep trying Nazis until they got to the bottom of the barrel and they didn't have to prosecute anymore. Boy, were they kind of wrong about that, if I'm putting it lightly. Now, the men they were going to try, the Nazis that they actually had their hands on, that could be put into the dock and tried. They were going to do 24 because that was how many seats they had. One of them had to be cut from the list because he was completely mentally not there. It was Krupp. who had headed a German industrial company during the war, and his son was actually also Krupp, and they couldn't figure out which one it was, so they ended up cutting the senior Krupp. His son would later be tried and face some punishment. But they cut him. They tried Martin Bormann, who was the Nazi Party secretary, and nobody knew where he was, so they tried him in absentia, meaning if they ever found him, he would be facing whatever verdict they gave him. There was rumors that he was dead, but there were also rumors he'd been spotted. Nobody knew yet where he was, or if he was even around. Then the highest-ranking Nazi still alive and being put on trial was Hermann Göring. He was Hitler's designated successor up until the last few days of Hitler's life and the life of the Third Reich. He was the head of the Luftwaffe, the head of the 4-year plan for Germany. He had his fingers, as Jackson said, his pudgy fingers in every little pie. He was the guy who came up with the idea for the Gestapo in Prussia, later got nationalized by Hitler, and he was just, at the time when he was captured, he was extremely overweight, addicted to a painkiller drug, and thought that when he surrendered to the Americans, he would be treated as a statesman. Thank God he was wrong about that. He was utterly without humanity outside of a few chosen people, like his wife and kid and a handful of people around him, and he could turn against them in an instant. The man was utterly corrupt. He stole millions of dollars worth of art from all across Europe. Now, that probably saved it from destruction, but he basically stole all of it. He was a heavy drinker, and only through his vanity, appealing to his vanity, were the Allies able to force him to lose weight by saying, oh, a great man like you can lose weight and beat this addiction, right? Other men are weaker, you can do it. And he literally did exactly that. He went cold turkey and lost, I think they said 60 pounds in a few months. So, again, highest ranking Nazi to be captured. And he was up to his neck in everything, completely everything of the Nazi regime. Next, you had Rudolf Hess, who had been Hitler's third in command, his deputy Fuhrer, up until 1941, where he had, in an inexplicable act, flown without authorization to Britain to try and persuade Britain to sue for peace so that Hitler could invade Russia without fighting a two-front war with Britain. Thankfully, those peace overtures completely failed, and he was in jail for 4 years in Britain as a prisoner of war. It was thought that Hess was crazy. Hitler even said he was crazy and removed him from the line of succession. And Hess claims to have forgotten everything. Everything. And then in the middle of the trial, when he learns that if he is found mentally incompetent, he'll be removed from the trial and away from everybody he knows, he immediately says to all the judges and the psychiatrists, guess what? My memory's back. I remember everything. This guy was not stable in the mind, that's for sure. The only thing he had going for him going into this trial was that he was fanatically loyal to Hitler. He went to jail with him during the 1924 putsch in Munich. Or was it 1923? Either way, he was fanatically loyal to Hitler. Next, you had Karl Dönitz, who had been the Admiral of the Navy and the final Fuhrer of Germany when they surrendered. He was on trial for what the Kriegsmarine, the submarines, had done during the war, basically. You had Erich Raeder, who had been Dönitz's superior until 1943 and a supporter of Hitler basically through the entire war. You had Joachim von Ribbentrop, who had been the Nazi foreign minister from 1938 all the way to the end of the war with Hitler, and he was known as Hitler's lackey. Like, there was nothing that Ribbentrop wouldn't do for Hitler. He was completely up to his neck in blood, and I mean, the man was completely incompetent when it came to diplomacy, but he had Hitler's favor. You had Hans Frank, who had been the personal lawyer for Hitler and the Nazi Party in the early years, and then made Governor General of Poland after the Nazis conquered it in 1939, where he would take control of the area where most of the Holocaust was going to happen, where most of the death camps were. He was known as the Jew Butcher of Krakow. You had Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior when Hitler became Chancellor, which basically meant the police. Wilhelm Frick had control of the police, and he was a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi. And he struggled for control of everything he had in Nazi Germany, ended up losing most of that to Göring, but he was still, also he helped write the Nuremberg race laws. And he also squirreled away a lot of ill-gotten gains into some shell companies by the end of the war, and he wanted to make sure that nobody touched it while he was on trial. You had Walther Funk, who was the president of the Reichsbank from 1940 to the end of the war, where it was found out that he knew exactly where all the gold from the concentration camps was coming from. He knew where it was coming from and how it was gotten. That's what he was on trial for mainly. Hans Fritzsche, head of the news division of propaganda. He was somebody who sounded a lot like Joseph Goebbels, and he was going to be on trial basically in his place. Alfred Jodl, he was the chief of staff of the OKW and subordinate to Wilhelm Keitel. He was basically in charge of making sure that Keitel's orders, basically Hitler's orders, went through and organizing them and figuring out ways to keep the war going. And he was loyal to Hitler to the end. He believed in obedience over anything else. And you also had, as I said, Wilhelm Keitel. He was the head of the Wehrmacht and basically Jodl's superior. He was known for being a lickspittle, basically being a bootlicker of Hitler's. Like, whenever Hitler ordered something done, Keitel did it. To him, obedience to Hitler, who he believed was way smarter than him, who had his personal loyalty, nothing that Hitler ordered was too far for him to follow those orders. Never turned against him, not once. As I mentioned, Gustav Krupp, he was cut from the list. You had Alfred Rosenberg. He was Minister of the Eastern Occupied Territories, as well as being the quote-unquote head philosopher of the Nazi Party. In reality, he was a pretty stupid man who believed in the racial policies of the Nazi Party to an extreme and was completely loyal to Hitler. And the occupied Eastern Territories are basically the territory of Russia that the Nazis took in 1941, 1942, and he ruled them worse than the Pharaoh of Egypt ruled over the Hebrew slaves. Worse than most American plantation owners would rule over their subjects. You had Robert Ley. He was the head of the German Labor Front, and it was his job to represent all the defunct and banned trade unions all into one group of Germans, and to bring their grievances, their ideas, trying to get the military machinery working within the civilian sphere. Now, Ley would actually not face the trial in the end. He would kill himself in Nuremberg, which left 21 defendants for the prosecution to go after. He killed himself by strangulation in his cell. Forgive me. You had Fritz Sauckel. He was the plenipotentiary of Nazi slave labor. So it was his job to round up all the foreign workers he could to come and work in Germany, whether they wanted to or not. it is estimated that he gathered up 5 million workers, of whom only 250,000 came voluntarily. The rest were just grabbed and forced to work. The conditions they worked in, even though he, quote-unquote, called for their decent treatment, not out of any humanity, but simply to keep them working, was, it was horrible. Like, thousands died under these work conditions. Starvation, disease, murder, suicide. It was horrifying working in those conditions under Fritz Sauckel. You had his superior, Albert Speer, who was the Minister of Armaments from 1942 to 1945. And Speer we would now know as the quote-unquote good Nazi, even though evidence shows that he wasn't. He was Hitler's chief architect and probably one of Hitler's few personal friends. And throughout this trial, he would deport himself extremely well, but his fate would have to be decided by the judges because he was in charge of the armaments factories where the conditions for the slave laborers was horrible. And Speer would have to defend his conduct of how he allowed this to happen, even though he should have known better as a very well-educated, well-to-do man. You had Konstantin von Neurath. He was the Reich Minister of Bohemia and Moravia, which he held with both, he tried to hold it with a velvet glove in an iron fist with a velvet glove, but that did not mean much in a Nazi world. He'd also been Hitler's foreign minister for a while until replaced by von Ribbentrop. You had Arthur Seyss-Inquart. He was the Reich Commissar of the Netherlands, and he was fanatically loyal to Hitler. He never turned against him. He deported over 140,000 Jews from the Netherlands to the death camps. And he signed those orders. He replaced as many Dutch with Nazis as he could without upsetting the Dutch, which it wasn't ever going to work. Then you had Hjalmar Schacht. He had been president of the Reichsbank until 1938, until Hitler replaced him, and also economics minister till 1937. So he was in charge of the German economy to get it back on its feet from 1934 to 1937. And in the end, he was found in a concentration camp that he was put into in 1944 by Hitler for being suspected of being part of the bomb plot. But a lot of people were not sure what Schacht was. Was he loyal to the Nazis? He helped them rearm. But was he loyal to the resistance, which he was in prison for? The tribunal would have to find out. You also had Franz von Papen. He had been vice chancellor under Hitler in 1933 and was instrumental in getting Hitler into power, and then keeping Hitler in power from 1933 to 1934 until the night of the Long Knives, when his personal secretary was actually found dead. And he accepted the Nazis' assurances that the reason he was dead was because he was plotting to kill von Papen. Very unlikely, to say the least. But he had been ambassador to Turkey for the last 4 years. So he was being charged with helping bring the Nazis to power and for most of their anti-Semitism in government, for giving a conservative shine to the Nazi Party. You had Walther von Schirach. He was the head of the Hitler Youth and Gauleiter of Vienna, where he had deported thousands of Jews to Auschwitz and imprisoned many political opponents in Dachau. And as head of the Hitler Youth, he had used them, he had helped to train them up as future soldiers. And last, you had Julius Streicher, Gauleiter Franconia and publisher of Der Sturm, which was the most anti-Semitic newspaper in all of Germany, possibly in the entire world. It was also one of the most pornographic newspapers ever seen. Streicher himself was an early fighter for Hitler in the 1920s, and he was so vulgar, so horrible, that even Hitler had to put him under house arrest in 1940 when Streicher accused Göring of being infertile and that the child that his wife had wasn't his. So Streicher was out of power in Franconia, where he had been a routine rapist and a corrupt, vile toad. And he was on trial for being a propagandist, for being a cheerleader, for saying that the Jews were a race of bloodsuckers and needed to be destroyed. Now, I know this was a much longer video and I covered a lot of names. I promise you I'm going to put all their names in the description, as well as hopefully what they were doing at the time that they were captured, or I should say running the Nazi government. So thank you guys for listening. I know this was a much longer video than the other two, but these are very fascinating fellows as far as you can go on the dark side of history. And our next video, we will be covering what they say their defense is and what the witnesses and what the trial really shows. So, guys, take care, my wolf pack. Catch you later.